Imagine the winter of 1886. The Dakota Territory is gripped by the Great Blizzard, a whiteout so absolute it buried entire towns under 20 feet of ice. On the outskirts of Blackwood, the neighbors of the widow Margaret Thorne watched as her massive barn, a structure 3 times the size of any other in the county, finally succumbed to a different disaster. As the timber frame collapsed in a roar of flame, the townspeople didn't find charred hay or frozen livestock in the ruins. They found a skull the size of a carriage and a ribcage so massive it glowed in the embers like the hull of a wrecked ship. The history books tell us the giants died out millennia ago. But the ashes of a lonely widow's farm suggest they were here just a century ago. For decades, the settlers of the Dakota frontier told stories of the woman in the great barn. To some, she was Margaret Thorne. To others, she was Sarah Hutchins. But to everyone in the territory, she was a reclusive mystery. While other pioneers struggled to raise humble log cabins, this lone widow supposedly managed to construct a fortress of stone and timber that defied the engineering of the era. When the neighbors offered help during the brutal Great Die-Up of 1886, she turned them away at the gate with a shotgun. People called her mad. They laughed at the deep foundations she spent years digging by hand. But after the fire, the laughter stopped. Beneath the charred remains of that barn, the town discovered a subcellar 15 feet deep, lined with megalithic stone blocks that no single woman and no team of oxen could have moved. Inside lay the remains of a 12-foot humanoid, a silent guest she had been feeding and hiding for years. Was this a living survivor of a forgotten race, or the petrified skeletal remains of a world that existed before the flood? To understand what the town really found, we have to look past the campfire stories and into the cold, hard records of the 19th century. When we look at this story today, we run into our first major obstacle, the modern digital echo chamber. If you search for the story of the widow's giant, you'll find it across dozens of mystery channels and social media reels. But look closer at the details. In one version of the viral narrative, the widow is named Margaret Thorne. In another, she is Sarah Hutchins. The dates shift from the blizzard of 1873 to the winter of 1886. Even the location bounces between the Dakota Territory and the mountains of Montana. This is what researchers call the Mad Lib effect. It's a technique where a core narrative is recycled with different names and dates to maximize clicks. In fact, some of the most popular videos on this topic use the exact same thumbnail and archival footage to tell 2 completely different stories. One version claims she dug a secret room to save her children from the cold. The other claims she was hiding a 12-foot titan from the authorities. The images often associated with these stories are equally suspicious. Many are clearly the product of modern artificial intelligence designed to look like worn, sepia-toned photographs. We have to ask, if the evidence is being manufactured today, does that mean the entire event is a fiction? Or is someone using AI to drown out a real historical anomaly? When we dig into the actual local archives of the 1880s, we find plenty of reports on the Great Blizzard. The storm so fierce it froze cattle where they stood. But we don't find a single contemporary newspaper report of a widow in Blackwood being arrested for hiding a giant skeleton. In the world of the 19th century press, a story like that would have been a national sensation. It would have sold thousands of papers from New York to San Francisco. So why is there a total blackout in the official record? Some believe the answer lies in the dates themselves. 1873 and 1886 were years of total chaos on the frontier. In times of disaster, it is much easier to make evidence disappear. If a giant was found, a catastrophic fire provides the perfect excuse for why the bones were lost or turned to ash before they could be measured. However, there is a recurring theme in these widow stories that we cannot ignore. They all describe a massive, oversized structure that predated the farm itself. If the widow didn't build that barn, who did? And why was it built to accommodate someone twice the height of a normal human? The official narrative says these stories are just pioneer folklore, creepypastas for the digital age. But if this story is a modern invention, why does it feel so familiar? Why does it perfectly mirror the very real and very documented giant fever that gripped America just a few years earlier? The truth is, before the widow's barn ever caught fire, the United States was already obsessed with the idea of giants hiding beneath its soil. To understand the widow's story, we have to travel back to October 16, 1869, to a small farm in Cardiff, New York. Two workmen were digging a well behind the barn of William Newell when their shovels struck something hard. 3 feet down, they unearthed a 10-foot-tall, petrified man. The discovery of the Cardiff giant became a global sensation. Within days, thousands of people were paying 50 cents a head just to catch a glimpse of the stone titan. The official history books tell us this was a simple hoax. They say a man named George Hull carved the figure out of gypsum to mock biblical literalists. And while Hull eventually confessed to the fraud, the public's reaction revealed something profound. In the late 1800s, Americans were already primed to believe that giants were hidden under their barns. But here is the detail that the skeptics often leave out. While the Cardiff giant was a statue, the newspaper archives of that era are overflowing with reports of skeletons that were very much made of bone. On May 4, 1885, the New York Times reported on a discovery in Gasterville, Pennsylvania. Workers digging a foundation unearthed a massive stone vault containing a skeleton that measured over 7 feet long, wearing a strange metallic crown. In 1897, near Menominee, Wisconsin, the St. Paul Globe reported that archaeologists found the remains of a giant race in a mound, with skulls so large they could easily fit over the head of a modern man. This wasn't just fringe news. These reports were coming from the most respected publications in the country, from the Chicago Tribune to the Washington Post. So why do we see a sudden spike in these findings between 1850 and 1920? And more importantly, where did all those bones go? This brings us to the document 1 from our research, a newspaper clipping headlined, "Giant Found Under Burning Barn." While many of the clippings you see on social media today are digital recreations, they are based on a very real phenomenon of 19th century fossil fever. During this period, the Smithsonian Institution was in its infancy, founded in 1846 with a mission to organize American history. According to their own annual reports from the 1880s, Smithsonian agents were dispatched across the country to collect these unusual remains from local farmers and widows. One such report from 1882 describes an agent named John W. Emmett excavating a mound in Tennessee and finding a skeleton that was extremely large, lying alongside stone tablets with strange, unknown writing. But once these artifacts reached the Smithsonian's doors, they seemed to enter a black hole. They were never put on public display. They were never photographed for journals. Instead, they were labeled as crude Indian remains or simply lost in administrative transitions. Researchers like Vine Deloria Jr. have pointed out that the Smithsonian's own records prove they were actively suppressing anything that didn't fit the standardized history of the time. Now, look back at the widow Margaret Thorne. If she really did find a 12-foot skeleton under her barn, she would have known exactly what happened to the others. She would have seen the collectors coming to take the history of the land away, piece by piece. In this light, Her reclusive nature and her shotgun at the gate start to make a different kind of sense. She wasn't just a mad woman, she was a protector. But what was she protecting? Was it just a pile of old bones, or was it the evidence of a civilization so advanced that its mere existence would make our modern world look like a regression? If these giants were as common as the 19th century newspapers suggest, we have to ask, what kind of structures were they actually living in? The official story says the widow built an oversized barn out of necessity. But if we look at the architecture of the Old World, we see a pattern that suggests the barn wasn't a barn at all. It was a remnant of a global empire that was wiped off the map by a disaster the history books refuse to name. But if the giants were the architects of our world, why did their architecture look so out of place in a 19th century farmyard? This is where the story shifts from a simple prank to a global cover-up involving the lost empire of Tartaria. To truly understand why a widow would hide a giant, we have to look at the world she lived in through a different lens. In the Tartarian research community, we often talk about the mud flood, a global cataclysm that occurred sometime in the mid-19th century. This wasn't just a local flood. It was a massive displacement of Earth that buried the first floors of existing civilizations across every continent. When you look at photos of Salt Lake City, Chicago, or even small prairie towns in the 1870s, you see something impossible. You see massive, grand stone buildings with half windows peeking out from the soil. You see temporary wooden sidewalks built several feet above the original ground level. The official story says this was just 19th century grading or a style choice. But what if the pioneers weren't building these towns? What if they were just digging them out? This brings us back to the widow Margaret Thorne and her oversized barn. According to the Tartarian theory, many of the barns and silos built in the American West weren't original structures. They were actually the upper chimneys or ventilation shafts of much larger, buried Tartarian power stations and outposts. Imagine the widow moving onto a plot of land and finding a massive stone foundation already protruding from the dirt. To the rest of the world, she was building a barn. But in reality, she was simply clearing the mud out of a pre-existing Tartarian structure. Look at the proportions of these old-world barns. Why do they have doors that are 20 feet high? Farmers will tell you it was for ventilation or stacking hay. But that doesn't explain the massive, megalithic stone blocks at the base, stones that weigh several tons each. These are the same stone-cutting techniques we see in the grand star forts of Europe and the massive cathedrals of Russia. It is the signature of the Tartarian Empire, a global civilization that used atmospheric energy to power the world. And in this empire, humans weren't the only citizens. Proponents of this theory believe that Tartaria was a biological mosaic. It was a world where humans coexisted with a race of giants, the guardians of Tartaria. These giants weren't the savages we see in fairy tales, they were the master architects. They were the ones who could lift the heavy masonry and position the spires. Evidence suggests that when the mud flood hit, the giants were the hardest hit. Their subterranean cities were flooded first. Their height made them easy targets for the New World Order that rose to fill the vacuum. Between 1850 and 1920, a systematic cleansing of the giants took place. History calls it the Indian Wars or frontier expansion. But what if those wars were actually targeted at the last remnants of the Tartarian guardians? This is why the story of the widow is so significant. She wasn't just hiding a monster. She was hiding a survivor. What if that 12-foot humanoid found in the barn wasn't a skeleton at all when she first found him? What if he was a living refugee, a displaced citizen of a fallen empire who had nowhere else to go? Think about the reclusive nature of these pioneer widows. They often lived on the extreme edges of society, away from the prying eyes of the government and the scientific committees. A giant in 1886 would have been a hunted creature. The official narrative of Darwinism was just being established, and a living giant would have debunked the entire theory of human evolution overnight. The Smithsonian agents weren't just looking for bones, they were looking to ensure that no living evidence of the old world remained. This explains why the town found a sub-cellar lined with megalithic stone. The widow didn't dig that cellar. It was a Tartarian bunker, a piece of pre-flood technology that she used to shield her guest from the collectors. But the fire changed everything. Fire is the ultimate tool of the controllers. When a structure is burned to the ground, the evidence is sanitized. The bones can be claimed as charred remains or deformed timber. The fire at Blackwood wasn't an accident. It was an erasure. In the Tartaria connection, the widow represents the last link between the old world and the new. She was a caretaker of the Guardians. When she died and when her barn burned, the last living memory of the Tartarian giants was turned to ash. But even after the fire, the controllers had a problem. They couldn't hide the foundations. They couldn't hide the massive stone blocks that didn't belong in a 19th century farmyard. So, they did what they always do. They turned the truth into a ghost story. They allowed the legend of the widow's giant to survive as a piece of folklore, a creepypasta that no serious person would ever believe. Because if you think it's just a scary story, you'll never look at the actual ruins beneath your own feet. If the giants were the architects of our world, their existence would destroy the modern narrative of primitive ancestors. And that's why they had to disappear twice, once from the world and once from our memories. But as the digital age matures, the cracks in that memory hole are starting to show. We are starting to find the photos that were supposed to be destroyed. We are starting to see the patterns in the architecture that we were told were just for show. And when you look at the evidence of modern suppression, you realize that the fire at the widow's barn never really stopped burning. It's still happening today. Only now, the fire is digital. If you think the days of hiding giant bones are over, you haven't seen the digital bone holes of the 21st century. Whenever a new, unexplained discovery is made today, the controllers don't need a fire to erase it. They use the algorithm. Consider the photo 1 from our research, a striking image of men in bowler hats standing over a massive 12-foot skeleton in a deep trench. This photo has circulated for years as proof of the Smithsonian's secret excavations. But if you trace its origin, you'll find it linked to Photoshop contests and modern AI generators. The skeptics use this as a gotcha to debunk the entire history of giants. They say, look, the photo is a fake, therefore the history is a lie. But this is a classic psychological operation. By flooding the internet with obvious fakes, they make the real archival evidence look guilty by association. The real evidence isn't found in a Midjourney prompt. It's found in the annual report of the Board of Regents of the Smithsonian Institution. In the 1894 report on page 491, the institution's own ethnologist Cyrus Thomas describes finding a skeleton that was 7.5 feet tall in a mound in West Virginia. Where is that skeleton now? It isn't on display in Washington, D.C. It isn't in any university museum. It has simply vanished into the administrative vacuum. This is the legacy of the Powell Doctrine. John Wesley Powell, the second director of the Bureau of Ethnology, established a strict policy in the 1890s. He mandated that all American history must be standardized to show that no advanced or giant race ever predated the Native Americans. Anything that suggested otherwise, like the widow's megalithic cellar, was to be treated as a natural anomaly or a hoax. This brings us to the modern fire pattern. Have you noticed how many historical archives and old-world buildings have suffered accidental fires in the last decade? In 2018, the National Museum of Brazil burned, destroying 20 million artifacts, including irreplaceable indigenous records that many believe documented the giant era. When the evidence can't be explained, it is liquidated. In the case of the widow Margaret Thorne, the fire served two purposes. It destroyed the biological evidence of the giant, and it provided a logical reason for why the town couldn't study the remains. Today, we see a different kind of fire. When a researcher posts a legitimate 19th century newspaper clipping about giant finds, social media platforms shadow ban or flag the content as misinformation. They tell us to trust the digital image, yet the digital image is exactly what they use to betray our senses. We are told that we are the most advanced humans to ever walk the earth. But if that's true, why can't we recreate the masonry found in that widow's subcellar? Why is our modern construction designed to last 50 years while the barn foundations of the 1800s are still standing, immovable, after a century of neglect? The truth is, the official record is a carefully manicured garden. Anything that grows too tall, anything that looks too giant, is pruned away before the public can see it. But the roots of that hidden history are still in the ground. And as more people start to look at the architecture that still stands, the garden walls are starting to crumble. Why does a story about a widow and a giant matter in the age of artificial intelligence and space travel? Because the story isn't just about bones, it's about our loss of sovereignty and the true origin of our civilization. If we don't know who actually built the foundations of our cities and farms, we don't truly know who we are. We are told that we are the peak of human achievement, yet we live in the hand-me-down ruins of a grander era that we can no longer replicate or explain. The widow Margaret Thorne has become a powerful symbol in the modern Tartaria movement. She represents the forgotten historian. She is the person who holds the truth in her hands but is labeled insane or dangerous by her neighbors because her reality doesn't match the official script. In today's world, we see this same pattern repeating. Anyone who questions the standardized timeline is treated with the same mockery the widow faced before her barn burned down. The explosion of interest in Tartaria and the hidden giants isn't just about escapism or fantasy. It is a reaction to a deep, collective intuition that something massive is missing from our world. We look at the clunky, fragile nature of our modern technology, and then we look at the silent, majestic masonry of the old world, and we feel the weight of a downgrade. The giant under the barn is a metaphor for the massive, uncomfortable truth that is buried right beneath our feet. It is the knowledge that we were once part of a global, high-tech, and harmonious civilization that was systematically dismantled and erased. When we see the oversized doors in our oldest buildings or the subcellars that make no sense for modern storage, we are looking at the fingerprints of the guardians. The widow's choice to stay reclusive was a choice to live in the truth, even if it meant living in isolation. Today, we are being asked to make that same choice. Will we accept the fire-sanitized version of history? Or will we keep digging through the ashes? Whether the giant was a living person, a skeletal remain, or a metaphor for a grander history, the barn has burned down. What's left is the subcellar of our own curiosity and the courage to look inside. The story of the widow Margaret Thorne and the giant in her barn may be a digital ghost, but the questions it raises are very real. We live in a world where the physical evidence of the past is being liquidated, while the digital version of history is being rewritten in real time. Was there a 12-foot titan hiding beneath the Dakota soil in 1886? Or is the giant actually the massive, uncomfortable truth of a suppressed Tartarian heritage that the authorities can no longer contain? The widow may have lost her farm to the flames, but she left us a riddle that the controllers still can't solve. The next time you're driving through the American heartland and you see an old stone barn with doors too high and a foundation too deep, ask yourself, who was it really built for? If you want to see the maps they don't show in school, check the links below for our deep dive into the Tartarian world map. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel to join our growing community of researchers. Keep your eyes on the architecture and your hands on the archives before they fill the hole for good. Because history isn't just what's written, it's what survives.